Next speaker is yes, Mia Blakstad. She is presenting a cluster-randomized home gardening program, improves dietary diversity and food security among rural Tanzanian women. Please
Thank
go
you.
ahead.
This is on? Great. Well, it's been great to hear so many other related trials. I hope this is still interesting, and thank you all for sticking around to the end. My name is Mia Blakstad. I'm a first-year PhD student, and I'll be talking about another home gardening trial. I'll quickly hop through an outline. We'll cover an introduction, the methods, results and discussion, pretty standard outline. So in Tanzania where we work, there's a substantial burden of hunger, and particularly in the Pwani region, which you can see here. The darker colors indicate lower levels of total per capita caloric intakes per day. Another aspect of the Tanzanian diet is most of the calories come from starchy staples, which are generally low in micronutrients and often don't confer the nutrients necessary for maintaining essential health functions. A very popular recently way of combating this issue is to introduce homestead food production or home gardens. And these are generally thought to improve nutritional outcomes through both direct consumption of vegetables, through sale of excess produce, and also through women's empowerment if the women are in charge of the revenue gained from that vegetable sale. And the theoretical gains, some of them, of homestead food production include increased food security just from a pure quantitative increase in the amount of food. Also from dietary diversity, and specifically, we hope that it increases consumption of nutrient-dense food groups. A lot of literature has looked at these associations, but a systematic review a few years ago called for more causal inference on stronger methodological design. So we tried to fill that gap by conducting a cluster randomized trial on homestead food production in Rufiji, Tanzania. We recruited households with women of reproductive age and at least one child between 6 and 36 months. And they also had to have access to a plot of land or a container where they could grow vegetables. And our goals overall was to improve the nutrition and health of the participating household through increased vegetable consumption. So the research question that we're really trying to hone in on and get a causal estimate of is whether homestead food production improves dietary diversity among the participants in our study population. We also wanted to look at whether it improves the consumption of specific nutrient-rich food groups and also whether it has any impact on the food security in the community. Here's a map of the Rufiji district, and the highlighted regions are the villages that were included in our trial. We did a pair-matched cluster randomized trial in 10 villages with a total enrollment of about 1,000 participants. The intervention included providing seeds and other agricultural inputs that was delivered by agricultural extension workers who are government employees already in the field. We also included behavioral change component that covered nutritional and health counseling, and that was provided by the community health workers. Those messages and inputs were delivered both at one-to-one home visits and during village-level farmer field schools every 2 weeks. And the control villages received the standard of care, which was visitation regularly by community health workers and agricultural extension workers. Unfortunately, those are really hard to reach because there's a limited budget for travel fuel for the motorcycles to reach the remote villages. So data collection so far has happened at baseline and a 1-year follow-up, which is the data that I'll be using for this analysis. And then in a couple of weeks, we'll be starting our 3-year follow-up for endline, which hopefully will have additional exciting results. Our outcomes of interest were women's dietary diversity, both continuous as the number of food groups out of 10 consumed, and also the threshold minimum dietary diversity of 5 or more food groups per day, which is generally correlated with micronutrient adequacy. We also looked at household food insecurity access scale, both as a continuous score and converted into categories according to the Coates et al. Guidelines. So in expectations, when you have a randomized controlled trial, you hope that your treatment and control groups will be exchangeable Unfortunately, that wasn't the case, as typically happens in practice when you have randomization within few clusters. We randomized 10 villages into treatment or control, and so to try to account for the baseline covariate imbalance, we weighted by inverse probability of intervention weights. We also had a little bit of differential loss to follow-up, which is always fun. We accounted for that by inverse probability of censoring weights. And then since we had so many hypotheses that we wanted to test, we wanted to adjust for the chance of multiple comparison with the Bonferroni correction. And our new p-value of statistical significance is, as you can see, very low, which just means that we're super conservative in our inference and hopefully very confident in our results. So some baseline household characteristics. The total enrollment, as I mentioned, was about 1,000 caregiver infant pairs. About half of the women had received and completed primary education. Most of them were informally employed, spent about $50 a day on food, and consumed on average 3 food groups a day, and each household grew about 3 crops at baseline. And so the exciting results, and I appreciate you bearing with me at the end of the day. We saw almost an entire increase in almost an entire food group consumed per day, comparing control households to intervention households. So the intervention households were eating almost 1 out of 10 more food groups, and it was statistically significant. And then also a decrease similar to Vicky's result of about 2 points on the household food insecurity access scale among the intervention households. We also looked at the probability of severe food insecurity and the probability of achieving minimum dietary diversity. In the control group, there was about a quarter of the population that was severely food insecure. And then if you compare that with the intervention households, there were only 3% that were severely food insecure. So we almost eliminated severe food insecurity in our intervention villages. Similarly, about a quarter of the control household achieved minimum dietary diversity, whereas about half of the people in our intervention villages consumed a minimally diverse diet. And then if we break this down by the specific food groups, after our very strict Bonferroni correction, dark green vitamin A-rich vegetables is a food group that remains significant. But if you were to not make the Bonferroni correction, you would also see improvement in beans and peas, other fruits, and other vitamin A-rich fruits and vegetables. And this makes general sense as the seeds that we were providing were for dark green vitamin A-rich vegetables, so that's kind of what you would expect to see. So what can we infer from our results? We found large improvements in I think they're large, I'm biased though, improvements in dietary diversity and food security, and that is consistent with the quasi-experimental and observational literature on homestead food production and its association with dietary diversity, as demonstrated by HKI and many other studies. As far as I can tell, and please feel free to email me with your randomized controlled trial if you have one. I'd love to hear about it. Only in Burkina Faso have they directly looked at dietary diversity from a randomized controlled trial, but saw increases in consumption of certain food groups, but not the actual dietary diversity score, only marginally significant improvements. And other trials have looked at other outcomes. But I'm very open to hearing more about your research. I'd be very interested to hear that. Some quick strengths and limitations. Our methodology was rigorous. It was a cluster randomized controlled trial. Our statistical analysis is by the book and very conservative, and our estimates are, if anything, underestimates based on many different analyses. We also bootstrapped our errors and found similar confidence intervals. Some limitations, as I mentioned, was the covariate imbalance from the small number of clusters, and that we assessed dietary patterns at the same time point, both at baseline and midline, but we don't know the effect of homestead food production on dietary diversity in other parts of the year, which would be interesting to measure. So the next steps are the end line follow-up at 3 years. We hope to do a longitudinal assessment for women and children of dietary diversity and anthropometry and anemia in a subset of the population, and look at potential mediators of that relationship, for instance, income, whether you can afford basic inputs to your garden, water access either through distance to a water source or the ability to obtain it some other way in some women's empowerment indices. And hopefully in the future we can collect some depression data to supplement our inference. I'd like to acknowledge everyone on the team who's been tremendous help, and all of our mentors and collaborators, and also everyone in the audience who have been paying attention through a very long day and an excellent conference. So thank you very much for listening.